In the summer of 1914, the world stood on the edge of a cliff, and then it fell. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria in Sarajevo lit the fuse. Within weeks, Europe, divided by empires and tangled in alliances, descended into chaos. But what followed was not just a war. It was a dark transformation of human history. World War I changed everything. It was the first modern industrial war where machines replaced men, and death came not only from bullets but from invisible clouds and roaring engines. The scale of violence was staggering, but so too was its cruelty. In the trenches stretching from France to Belgium, soldiers lived in unimaginable conditions. Mud clung to their uniforms. Rats the size of cats fed on the dead. Lice burrowed into their clothes and skin, and the rain never stopped. Trench foot, caused by constant wetness, turned flesh gray and numb. In severe cases, limbs had to be amputated. Then came the gas. The Germans first unleashed chlorine gas in 1915 at Ypres. It attacked the lungs, suffocating its victims. Then came phosgene, twice as deadly. And later, mustard gas, odorless and silent. It blistered the skin, blinded soldiers, and burned the lungs from the inside out. Medical help was often too late. Protective masks arrived eventually, but fear of gas lingered in every breath. But this war wasn't just fought by Europeans. Britain, France, and others pulled soldiers from their colonies. Over 1.5 million Indian soldiers were sent to fight for the British Empire. Around 440,000 African troops served in the French army. Many served on the front lines. Many died far from home. And when they returned, they were ignored, forgotten, denied the rights their white comrades received. Their sacrifice was erased from monuments and memories, their service buried in silence. Death counted everyone equally. By the time the war ended, around 9 to 11 million soldiers were dead. Civilian casualties ranged from 6 to 13 million. An additional 23 million were wounded. The war scarred landscapes, nations, and generations, but the wounds ran deeper. Something else began to appear among the survivors. Something less visible: shell shock. Today we call it PTSD, but back then it was misunderstood and feared. Victims trembled uncontrollably. They were mute. They collapsed at the sound of a whistle or a bang. Officers believed many were cowards. The British Army executed over 300 men for what they called desertion or cowardice, when in reality, many of them were simply broken. And the horror didn't end with the armistice. In 1918, a virus swept across the globe, carried in part by soldiers returning home. The influenza pandemic, often called the Spanish flu, would infect nearly 1/3 of the global population. It killed at least 50 million people, with some estimates reaching 100 million. In India alone, around 12 to 17 million people died, nearly 5% of the population. It was the deadliest pandemic in modern history, and it was born in the shadow of war. Throughout the war, propaganda shaped public opinion. Governments censored battlefield images, glorified sacrifice, and painted the war as noble. In reality, there was little nobility in the mud of the Somme, in the shattered towns of Belgium, or in the cries of the wounded. Dissenters were jailed. Objectors were labeled traitors. Speaking against the war was dangerous. Silence became patriotism, and truth became treason. When the war ended in November 1918, there was no celebration, only exhaustion. The peace that followed would prove fragile and poisoned. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, punished Germany with brutal reparations and humiliation. It wasn't peace, it was resentment carved into law. That resentment festered. Economies collapsed, extremists rose. And 2 decades later, the world plunged into an even darker nightmare: World War II. So what was World War I? It was a war where men drowned in mud, where gas replaced honor, where sacrifice was measured in millions. It was a war where empire swallowed its colonies and racism denied them recognition. A war where mental wounds were punished with bullets. A war that left no one untouched. It was not the war to end all wars. It was the beginning of a century of suffering. And yet, it is often overshadowed. We remember the trenches and the poppies, but we forget the silence of colonial soldiers, the cold injustice of executions, the pandemics that followed, and the arrogance of leaders who gambled with lives. World War I was more than a conflict. It was a warning. A reminder that technology without humanity leads to destruction. That pride can bury peace, and that when history is ignored, it tends to repeat itself.